On a warm summer morning in 1972, a 16-year-old girl walked out of her home in suburban New Jersey, expecting it to be just another ordinary day. She had plans to visit a friend before heading to work. She never made it there. For 43 days, her family searched desperately for answers. Then, in late September, a local dog returned home carrying a human arm. What police found hidden deep inside a rocky hill known as Devil's Teeth would shock an entire community, and over the following decades, become one of America's most misunderstood cold cases. Newspapers called it a satanic ritual. Detectives weren't so sure. More than 50 years later, newly released police files suggest the truth may have been far different from the legend. Tonight, we're reopening the case of Jeannette DePalma. In the early 1970s, Springfield Township was the kind of place where parents rarely imagined violent crime could happen. Located in Union County, just outside New York City, Springfield was a quiet suburban community surrounded by wooded reservations, abandoned quarries, and narrow hiking trails. Children rode bicycles through neighborhoods without much concern. Teenagers hitchhiked between nearby towns. Neighbors knew each other's names. It wasn't paradise, but it felt safe. At least until the summer of 1972. Among the wooded hills surrounding Springfield stood an unusual rock formation locals had nicknamed Devil's Teeth. The name came from the jagged stone outcrops protruding from the hillside like enormous broken fangs. Long before the events of 1972, local teenagers had transformed the area into something of an urban legend. Stories spread about strange gatherings after dark, occult ceremonies, ghost sightings, and bonfires hidden deep inside the forest. Whether any of those stories were true hardly mattered. The place already carried an unsettling reputation, and years later, that reputation would become just as important as the evidence itself. Jeannette Christine DePalma was born in 1956. She grew up in Springfield with her parents and siblings in what friends described as a close-knit family. Those who knew her remembered a teenager who enjoyed spending time with friends, listening to music, and attending church. Unlike the image that would later emerge in sensational newspaper headlines, Jeannette had no documented connection to occult groups, underground cults, or criminal circles. She was simply 16 years old. Like many teenagers of the era, she often relied on hitchhiking to travel between neighboring towns. In the early 1970s, this was surprisingly common. It wasn't considered unusual for young people to accept rides from strangers, especially in suburban communities where violent crime seemed distant. Looking back from today's perspective, the practice feels incredibly dangerous. But in 1972, it barely raised eyebrows. No one imagined that one ordinary ride could become the beginning of a mystery lasting more than half a century. On the morning of August 7th, Jeannette left her family's home. According to relatives, she planned to visit a friend in Summit before later going to work. She was expected back. She never returned. At first, there was little reason for panic. Teenagers sometimes stayed out longer than expected. Communication depended on landline telephones. There were no mobile phones, no GPS, no social media, and no surveillance cameras on every corner. Hours passed. Then an entire day. Eventually, concern turned into fear. Her family contacted authorities and reported her missing. Police opened an investigation but immediately encountered a problem. There were almost no leads. No confirmed witnesses. No crime scene. No evidence suggesting whether she had left voluntarily or become the victim of a crime. Detectives interviewed friends, neighbors, classmates, co-workers, anyone who might have seen her after she left home. Several people believed they had spotted Jeannette hitchhiking toward nearby towns. None of those sightings could be conclusively verified. Every possible lead eventually reached a dead end. Days became weeks. Search teams combed wooded areas surrounding Springfield. Flyers circulated throughout Union County. Family members waited by the telephone, hoping for any news. Nothing came. Unlike many missing person cases, there were no ransom demands, no threatening letters, and no suspicious phone calls. It was as though Jeannette had simply vanished. As the investigation stalled, another reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. If she had been abducted, who had taken her, and why? Police quietly began considering the possibility that they were no longer searching for a missing teenager. They might already be investigating a homicide. Still, without a body, without forensic evidence, and without eyewitnesses, detectives had almost nothing to work with. The case slowly drifted toward becoming another unsolved disappearance. Then, 43 days after Jeannette was last seen alive, everything changed. Not because investigators uncovered a breakthrough, not because someone confessed, but because of a dog. A discovery so disturbing that it would transform a missing person investigation into one of the most infamous cold cases in American history. When investigators followed the trail left by that animal into the dense woods above Springfield, they expected to recover human remains. What they didn't expect was the place where those remains had been left, or the rumors that would soon eclipse the evidence itself. For weeks, Springfield had searched for a missing teenager. By late September, many feared the worst. But no one expected the breakthrough to come from an ordinary family dog, and no one could have predicted how quickly facts would give way to rumors. It happened on September 19th, 1972. A local resident noticed something deeply disturbing. His dog had returned home, carrying what appeared to be a human arm. Authorities were immediately contacted. Within hours, police officers, detectives, and search teams entered a heavily wooded area on the slopes overlooking the abandoned Houdale Quarry, near the rocky formation locals called Devil's Teeth. The terrain was difficult, with steep inclines, loose rocks, dense vegetation, and poor visibility even during daylight. As investigators moved deeper into the hillside, they found what everyone had feared. The remains belonged to 16-year-old Jeannette DePalma. After more than a month of searching, the missing girl had finally been found. But instead of providing answers, the discovery only deepened the mystery. By the time investigators reached the body, decomposition had progressed significantly. Exposure to weather, wildlife, and the passage of time had destroyed much of the forensic evidence that detectives desperately needed. The medical examiner faced an almost impossible task. Could the cause of death be determined? No. Could the exact time of death be established? No. Could investigators even confirm that Jeannette had died where she was found? Again, no. Almost immediately, uncertainty began filling the gaps left by missing evidence. Some officers believed the location itself looked unusual. The body rested on elevated ground among rocks and fallen branches. Nearby were Jeannette's personal belongings, including clothing and footwear. The arrangement of certain objects struck some investigators as odd. But whether those objects had been deliberately placed there, or simply shifted by weather, animals, or the natural environment, could not be determined with confidence. This distinction would prove crucial, because within days, the rumors began. Local newspapers quickly learned that detectives were considering every possible explanation. Some unnamed sources claimed the body had been surrounded by carefully arranged branches. Others described crosses made from sticks. Then came even more dramatic claims: pentagrams, occult symbols, ceremonial sacrifices, witchcraft, and satanic rituals. Each retelling became more sensational than the last. Before long, the case was no longer simply the murder of a missing teenager. It had become a story about evil itself. The location's nickname, Devil's Teeth, only fueled public imagination. To many readers, it sounded less like a geological formation and more like the setting of a horror film. The combination proved irresistible for the media. Television stations repeated the speculation. Regional newspapers echoed anonymous sources. Word spread rapidly across New Jersey. Soon, people who had never heard of Jeannette DePalma knew only one thing about the case: the girl found in a satanic ritual. There was just one problem. Very little of that narrative had actually been confirmed. While newspapers focused on the occult angle, detectives continued investigating the case as a homicide. They retraced Jeannette's final known movements. Friends were interviewed again. Family members answered difficult questions. Co-workers described the day she disappeared. Investigators searched for anyone who might have offered her a ride, because hitchhiking had been common among teenagers at the time. Police considered the possibility that Jeannette had entered a stranger's vehicle voluntarily, never realizing the danger. Numerous tips flooded into the department. Most went nowhere. Some witnesses believed they had seen Jeannette after August 7th. Others insisted they had seen suspicious vehicles near the wooded reservation. None of these reports produced enough evidence to identify a suspect. With no eyewitness to the crime, no murder weapon, and no reliable forensic timeline, detectives were forced to build the investigation almost entirely through circumstantial evidence. Every week that passed made solving the case even more difficult. Perhaps the most frustrating obstacle was the condition of the remains. Modern forensic science is capable of answering questions investigators in 1972 could only dream of. DNA analysis, advanced toxicology, microscopic trace evidence, and digital reconstruction. None of those tools were available. The decomposition severely limited what pathologists could conclude. There was no definitive medical finding proving how Jeannette died. No confirmed indication of sexual assault. No official determination identifying the weapon used. Even the question of whether she had been killed elsewhere and transported to Devil's Teeth remained unanswered. This uncertainty became fertile ground for speculation. When science cannot provide answers, people often create their own. Over the following years, stories surrounding the crime grew increasingly dramatic. Some claimed investigators had discovered black candles. Others described animal sacrifices. There were rumors of robed figures gathering in the woods. Some even insisted the body had been arranged on an altar. The problem is that many of these details originated from anonymous accounts, repeated newspaper stories, and secondhand recollections, not from evidence preserved in official investigative records. Decades later, when portions of the original case files and crime scene photographs became public, researchers noticed something remarkable. Many of the most famous elements of the ritual murder narrative were difficult or impossible to verify. The photographs did not clearly show an elaborate ceremonial scene. The reports contained uncertainty where later books and television programs often presented certainty. That discovery would eventually force historians, journalists, and independent investigators to ask a difficult question. Had America spent 50 years believing a story that was never actually supported by the evidence? If Jeannette DePalma wasn't the victim of a satanic ritual, then what really happened? Who benefited from placing her body on one of the most notorious hills in New Jersey? And why has no one ever been charged with her murder? For decades, the public believed Jeannette DePalma had been sacrificed in a satanic ritual. But what if that story was never supported by the evidence? What if one of America's most infamous occult murder cases wasn't an occult murder at all? When a crime remains unsolved, people naturally search for explanations. Sometimes those explanations are grounded in evidence. Other times, they're built from fear. By the early 1970s, reports of witchcraft, occult practices, and secret gatherings had begun appearing in newspapers across the United States. Although the nationwide satanic panic would not peak until the 1980s, fascination with the occult was already growing in popular culture. Against that backdrop, the discovery of a teenager's body on a rocky hill called Devil's Teeth created the perfect conditions for speculation. The location sounded sinister. The investigation lacked answers, and anonymous leaks from people connected to the case quickly filled the information vacuum. Within weeks, many newspapers were presenting the possibility of ritual murder, almost as if it were the leading explanation. But an important distinction often disappeared in the headlines. Investigators had explored the idea. They had not proven it. Those are two very different things. This question has become one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. For years, books, magazine articles, and television programs repeated claims that Jeannette's body had been discovered inside a ritual circle, surrounded by occult symbols, arranged branches, and ceremonial objects. Some versions even described black candles, animal remains, or elaborate altars. But when researchers eventually gained access to portions of the original investigative files, they found something unexpected. Many of those dramatic details were either unsupported, impossible to verify, or absent from the official documentation. Crime scene photographs showed a remote hillside covered with rocks, brush, and fallen vegetation. Jeannette's belongings were recovered nearby. However, the images did not clearly depict the elaborate ritual scene that popular culture had come to associate with the case. That doesn't necessarily mean every witness was lying. After decades, memories fade. Stories evolve. People unintentionally combine rumor with first-hand observation. But it does mean that historians must distinguish between what can be documented and what cannot. Among the people who devoted years to separating fact from fiction were Mark Moran and Jesse Pollock, researchers associated with Weird NJ. Rather than simply repeating old newspaper articles, they interviewed retired detectives, family members, local residents, and individuals connected to the original investigation. Their work culminated in the book Death on the Devil's Teeth, one of the most comprehensive examinations of the case ever published. The book doesn't argue that every rumor was false. Instead, it carefully compares decades of storytelling with the surviving evidence. One of its central themes is simple. The mystery surrounding Jeannette's death became so powerful that it eventually overshadowed the victim herself. Instead of asking who killed a 16-year-old girl, people became captivated by stories of satanic cults hidden in the New Jersey woods. In many ways, the legend became larger than in the investigation. Decades after the murder, additional police records and crime scene photographs were released through public records requests. For researchers, these files represented something invaluable. Not speculation, not secondhand memories. Original investigative material. The newly available documents revealed uncertainty where later retellings often claimed certainty. Detectives considered numerous possibilities. They documented observations. They followed leads. But nowhere did the evidence conclusively establish that Jeannette had been murdered as part of an organized ritual. This changed the conversation dramatically. Modern journalists reviewing the files began asking whether decades of sensational reporting had distorted public understanding of the case. If the evidence didn't support ritual murder, what explanation fit the facts more closely? Today, many researchers consider a far more ordinary and perhaps even more disturbing possibility. Jeannette may simply have become the victim of a conventional homicide. The circumstances of her disappearance support that theory. She was hitchhiking. She disappeared without witnesses. Her body was discovered weeks later in an isolated location. The advanced decomposition prevented investigators from determining exactly how she died. If she accepted a ride from the wrong person, the crime could have unfolded almost anywhere. Her killer may have transported the body afterward, choosing Devil's Teeth because it was secluded, difficult to access, and unlikely to be searched immediately. Such a scenario requires no occult conspiracy, no secret organization, and no ritual. Only one violent offender and an isolated dumping site. While this theory cannot be proven with the available evidence, many investigators now believe it aligns more closely with the known facts than the ritual murder narrative that dominated headlines for decades. Over the years, investigators and independent researchers also explored several alternative theories. Could the crime have been sexually motivated? The condition of the remains prevented a definitive answer. Could Jeannette have known her killer? Police never identified evidence strong enough to support that conclusion. Could a serial offender operating in the region have been responsible? Various names have been suggested over the years, but no suspect has ever been conclusively linked to the case through physical evidence. Every theory encounters the same obstacle. The most critical evidence was lost long before modern forensic techniques became available, and without that evidence, certainty remains impossible. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't only that Jeannette's killer was never identified. It's that the myths surrounding her death often overshadowed the life she actually lived. She became known as the girl from the satanic ritual. Yet the available evidence tells us far more about an unsolved homicide than about occult ceremonies. Sometimes mysteries become so captivating that they begin to replace reality. And when that happens, the victim risks being remembered for the legend instead of the truth. More than 50 years have passed since Jeannette DePalma disappeared. The rumors remain, the headlines endure, but the investigation is still open. And the most important question has never changed. Who killed Jeannette DePalma? Some mysteries remain unsolved because investigators never find enough evidence. Others remain unsolved because the truth becomes buried beneath decades of rumor. More than 50 years later, the case of Jeannette DePalma stands somewhere between those two realities. More than half a century has passed since Jeannette disappeared from the streets of Springfield. The neighborhoods have changed. The abandoned quarry has grown quieter. The trails around Devil's Teeth have become destinations for hikers, photographers, and curious visitors drawn by local folklore. Many of those who walk these woods know the legend. Far fewer know the facts. Officially, Jeannette DePalma's murder remains unsolved. No one has ever been charged. No suspect has ever been publicly identified as the killer. And because so much physical evidence was lost to time before modern forensic science existed, investigators have been left with little more than witness statements, aging documents, and unanswered questions. For detectives, cold cases are often described as puzzles with missing pieces. In Jeannette's case, some of those pieces may have disappeared forever. Despite the passage of time, investigators around the world have solved murders much older than this one. Advances in forensic genealogy, DNA technology, and digital evidence have transformed investigations once considered impossible. But Jeannette's case presents a unique challenge. The condition of her remains severely limited the forensic evidence available in 1972. If usable biological material no longer exists or was never preserved, the possibilities offered by modern DNA analysis become much smaller. That doesn't mean the investigation is hopeless. A forgotten witness could still come forward. Previously overlooked documents could emerge. Private collections, family records, or investigative notes might contain details that were never fully explored. Sometimes, a single conversation changes everything. History has shown that cold cases can break unexpectedly, even after decades of silence. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of this case has little to do with the crime itself. Instead, it reveals how stories evolve. Within days of the discovery at Devil's Teeth, speculation began filling the gaps left by uncertainty. Over the years, those rumors were repeated in newspapers, magazines, documentaries, books, and online discussions. Each retelling added another layer. Details became sharper. Claims became more dramatic. Possibilities slowly transformed into accepted facts. By the time many people first heard Jeannette's name, the narrative had already been written. She wasn't introduced as a missing teenager. She was introduced as the victim of a satanic ritual. Yet when journalists and independent researchers revisited the original investigative material decades later, they found a far more complicated picture. Not a solved mystery, not proof of the supernatural, simply an investigation filled with uncertainty. It's a reminder that myths don't always begin with lies. Sometimes they begin with unanswered questions. Amid all the theories, one detail is easy to lose sight of. Jeannette DePalma was not a character in an urban legend. She was a real 16-year-old girl. She had a family, friends, plans for the future. She disappeared during what should have been an ordinary day. Whatever happened after she accepted that final ride or wherever she spent her final hours ended a young life long before it truly began. For her family, the mystery was never entertainment. It was grief without closure. For more than 5 decades, they have lived without knowing who was responsible or why. That uncertainty is perhaps the longest lasting consequence of all. Cases like this force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. When evidence is scarce, the human mind instinctively searches for patterns. Sometimes those patterns reveal the truth. Other times they create stories that become almost impossible to separate from reality. The Devil's Teeth case reminds us why skepticism matters. Not because every rumor is false, but because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And in this investigation, much of what captured the public's imagination was never conclusively demonstrated by the surviving record. The most frightening possibility may not be that occult forces were responsible. It may be something far more ordinary. That an unidentified killer committed murder, disposed of a body in an isolated place, and disappeared into history without ever facing justice. Today, visitors still walk the trails near Devil's Teeth. The rocks remain exactly where they stood in 1972. The forest has reclaimed much of the landscape. Birds sing where detectives once searched. Wind moves through trees that silently witnessed whatever happened all those years ago. Somewhere within that silence lies the truth. Whether that truth will ever be discovered, no one knows. If you found this investigation interesting, consider subscribing to Evil Decoded. Every week we examine real criminal cases, separating documented evidence from myth, rumor, and speculation. Because sometimes, the real story is even more disturbing than the legend.